I'm really pleased to be here and introduce Joshua Aronson. The work he does is very important to a lot of us in a range of fields, and I want to display that by just a couple of anecdotes before I introduce him in particular. It was about 32 years ago that I delivered one of my earliest papers at a convention. I'm a political scientist by trade training and most of my time. When I was first in my field, women constituted about 10% of the people in my discipline. We were all the way up to maybe 15, 20% in graduate school then, but we were very much on our own. And I went to deliver a paper once on game theory and methodology, and very excited about doing it, kind of a new topic. And when I got up there on the dais, I found that my hands were sweating like they had never sweat before. I was petrified, and I have to tell you, speaking in public is much easier now that I've had 30 years of being a professor and many years of being in public. Just, it doesn't daunt me even if I'm about to keel over. At that time it was worse, but not this bad. And I tried to figure out what was making me so nervous, and especially self-conscious. And it was that it was one of my first papers in public, in a field where there were very few women. I was the only woman on the platform, and younger than everybody else by a far margin. And so I was very aware that when people passed their eyes over the panel, they would see me there as something that was different. I was very aware that I was working in a field that was extremely male at the time. I didn't know any women doing game theory, game experiments, methodology, that kind of stuff. It was very much a men's field. And that also made me look like they'd watch me more carefully. And I was applying it to my very new field, which was a very new field, of gender studies, using game theoretic and game experimental work to look at gender studies. And I realized as I sat there very consciously that one of the reasons why I was so scared is I felt like it wasn't me up there, it was a symbol. I was a woman in a man's field, I was a woman in a very men's subfield. I was being subversive in applying this to gender stuff, and I didn't think of myself as particularly subversive. I was a good little graduate student who thought I was just doing good social science. And I realized that one of the things that really frightened me was I had the feeling that it was not just a matter of whether my paper was good or bad, or I might fail or succeed on my own terms. But I really strongly felt consciously for the first time that any failure I had there would reflect on other women in my field, and other women there, and other women of my generation. It was palpable. It was the first time I recognized that. But I have to say I didn't have a name for it, because a name wasn't invented for it until much later. Recently, in doing one of the many first things as a woman I've gotten to do, one of the things about being old and my age is unless you're very, very normal in what you do, you get to be the first woman to do this and that and the other thing, and you get to have people ask you all the time, what's it like being the first woman to do this, that, and the other thing? When I became Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and once again people said, what's it like being the first woman to be Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences? I gave the same answer that actually a lot of women have been giving in similar situations, which is the best thing about it is no woman ever has to be the first in this position again. And the reason, largely, that it's not fun to be the first woman is because you know partly you don't have the luxury of just succeeding and failing on your own terms the way any other person would get to in your field. Because there are at least some people out there you know in everything you do who are watching. If you get angry, will say, oh, she's a woman, she can't control her emotions. Or if you get something wrong on an Excel sheet one day or another, oh, math problems. So you just, even if you're smart about it and even if you know better, it's hard to give up the idea that there are some people out there for whom you're not you, just succeeding or failing. You are a representative of a larger group, and you're succeeding or failing on their behalf. And therefore, I'm really very, very happy to be able to introduce Joshua Aronson, who's an associate professor of applied psychology at the Steinhardt School at NYU, who has been one of the leaders in the field of studying stereotype threat, which is one of the many names for the thing I was just describing that I had no name for 30 years ago, but was delightful to get a name for, especially when I was teaching women's studies and was able to help people understand the theory and the empirical work that's been done. Josh has his BA from the University of California in psychology and his MA and PhD from Princeton in social psychology. And he has spent his time studying stereotypes, self-esteem, motivation, and attitudes. Most of his work revolves around just these kinds of issues I've been raising for the past few minutes on how to remediate race and gender gaps in educational achievement and in work through standardized test performance and other kinds of issues where we can see the impact of stereotype threat and the impact of the fact that, as some of us say, minority groups, women, we're not stupid. We know what the stereotypes are about us. And the question is, what is the impact of knowing what those stereotypes are for the way we act on a day-to-day basis? He's worked with Claude Steele, and who is the social psychologist who's credited with the original development and influence of the idea of stereotype threat. But Joshua Aronson himself has won many awards on his own merits. The Career Award, a career award from the National Science Foundation, an Early Career Award from the American Psychological Association, a Faculty Scholar Award from the William T. Grant Foundation, and the G. Stanley Hall Award of the American Psychological Association. So please help me to welcome him to talk to us today about stereotype threat.
That was a very nice introduction, and I'm incredibly honored that you got out of your sick bed to deliver it.
My sick bed.
Well, so I'm going to talk to you about the stereotype threat and the nature and nurture of intelligence. That was a beautiful introduction to the experience of stereotype threat. I'm going to take you through some of the implications of that experience, and not only implications of that experience for understanding the nature of intelligence, but also the implications of that kind of experience for understanding how we can better nurture intelligence. I came into the study of this when Claude Steele asked me to do a postdoc with him, and I wanted to study self-esteem with him because he was a really interesting researcher in that area, and he said, okay, come to Stanford and study that with me, but I've got this new stuff that I haven't done any research yet on, but there's this feeling, and we don't really have a word for it yet, but it's that feeling you get when you think everybody thinks you might be dumb because you're black or because you're a woman in math. And so I didn't want to do it because I wasn't black and I wasn't a woman in math. And I didn't feel like I had that much to say about such a topic. But it turns out that I actually did. And as we started, as I went into that research kicking and screaming, we started doing the first studies on stereotype threat. It absolutely changed my life. And one of the things that I realized that this isn't just about women in math or African Americans or Latinos or anybody who suffers from well-known stereotypes. It turns out everyone is vulnerable to stereotype threat under certain circumstances, and I think it reveals a lot about the nature of social interaction. But the way that we first got interested in this work, the way that Claude started thinking about this, was to explain some difficult to understand but lawful patterns of achievement with regard to Black and Latino students. And the pattern looks something like this. Starting at the K through 12 level, actually even before, there are new studies showing that the test score gap between blacks and whites is actually very, very small. You can actually measure kids' intelligence when they're very, very young, and those gaps look very, very small, despite what the genetics people will tell you. The gaps are very small, but they widen as kids move through school. They tend to get wider as kids undergo the intervention designed to help everybody get smarter. It creates this, takes this very small gap and it widens it. That's the first failed intervention they will encounter, but not the last. At the high school level, you see the gap express itself as higher dropout rates amongst blacks and whites. We are now at record levels of dropout. National average for dropout is now 30% of all kids, 50% if you're African American or Latino. And the second big intervention that you get, No Child Left Behind, has also left more children behind. The dropout rates have gotten worse. At the college level, blacks and Latinos are roughly half as likely to go to college, about twice as likely to drop out if they do go to college. And finally, and most alarmingly, I don't know if you noticed, but this is sort of, this graph is modeled after the Homeland Security Terror Alert graph. One of the most astonishing and sad commentaries on our intervention system called the school system is that it's not working very well. We have more people in prison than ever before, and they are mostly black and Latinos. 1 out of every 15 Americans is in prison. 1 out of every 9 African American males is in prison. That's a terrible, not only a moral failing on our part, but it's also a financial one. Even if we weren't going to talk about the moral dimension of that, because we complain in this country when we have to pay about $10,000 per kid per year for school. But if we fail in that, we have a social safety net called the penal system in this country. It costs about $60,000 to incarcerate one person per year. So even if we spent double on schools, we could keep people out of prison. We'd be making a huge savings in money, not to mention in our moral bank accounts. Among women, at the K through 12 level, girls perform at or above the same level as boys on tests and in school. They may show a little bit less intrinsic interest in spatial tasks, but that's about the extent of the math gap between males and females at that level. At the middle school level, though, girls are earning equally high grades, but they start to show less confidence in mathematics. And the test score gap on tests, but not in homework or understanding of mathematical concepts, starts to emerge there. At the college level, women tend to perform worse on standardized tests of math, but they do well in their courses, pretty much just as well as men. However, far fewer choose hard math and science majors. So when at the highest level, while outperforming men in nearly every other area of academics, we now have sort of a male crisis. We've shifted now. If we're always thinking in terms of a crisis, women are doing so much better in school than men, except for in 3 areas. Computer science, physics, and engineering. Even in mathematics majors, there's almost as many women. There's 46% of the math majors now are women. Now, common explanations for these that we will hear a lot, and first and most notorious is the sort of bell curve argument that African Americans, for example, have lower innate intelligence. This is something that I reject, and that I think most scientists in this field reject. There are a few stalwarts who really believe in that, but there's not many of them. A better explanation is poverty. that race is often, almost always, confounded with class. And that, so when you look at African Americans, you're looking at people who tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and that carries problems of its own in terms of access to quality teaching, quality schools, stress in the household. All of these things can sort of add up to a less enriched environment for kids to learn basic intellectual skills. There's also this notion that there's a subculture that discourages academic success. It's a highly controversial area of study. Some people find, for example, the burden of evidence for the burden of acting white, that black students and Latino students hold each other back. They are mean to each other if they're mean to kids who care about school. They will beat you up on your way to school if you're carrying a book. That's the kind of argument. I'm starting to think that there's a bigger story there, which is more of an American story of anti-intellectualism. We tend to be, compared to other Western cultures, incredibly anti-intellectual. You may not notice it here at Boston University or in Cambridge, but as you venture out into this world, if you look who's occupying the White House now, you don't see a great deal of love of books, love of reading. We are reading now at lower rates than ever before. This generation, our generation, has a much worse vocabulary than just 30 years ago. We're getting smarter in certain ways. The kind of intelligence that is built by playing video games is actually increasing. Certain subtests of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Tests, we're scoring better than our forefathers, but we're getting stupider in other ways. And I think there is a larger culture of anti-intellectualism that whites can do okay in because they get second chances, by and large. But black students who get caught up in that larger culture of anti-intellectualism often don't get second chances. And I think that's a more accurate story than this group simply doesn't care about education. Common explanations for sex differences in math and sciences revolve around biology and testosterone. And I have to say that my opinions on this have changed a lot in the past few years. Lawrence Summers, who used to be the president of Harvard, got in big trouble because he suggested that one of the reasons that we don't see so many female engineers and female physicists has to do with biology. And actually think that he was largely right about that, it's not that he was right so much that he was not wrong in suggesting the hypothesis, because if you look at the data, there's really incontrovertible evidence that biology matters a lot. So, for example, the alternative hypothesis is that we somehow teach girls that they're not supposed to be good at math. They show an interest in spatial things. They walk over toward the Legos and we discourage that. And they'd rather play with dolls and we encourage that. I don't think so. Simon Baron-Cohen is a developmental psychologist who does research on babies. Babies were so young that you couldn't have any chance for parents to socialize them into liking math or disliking math. Basically, he gets babies when they're 25 hours old. He becomes part of your birthing room if you're having a baby. And what he finds is they'll take these brand new babies and they'll dangle mobiles in front of their faces. And the babies show you what they're interested in out of the womb naturally by what they pay attention to. That's a standard developmental psychologist tool. What does the baby show an interest in? Well, it depends on whether it's a boy or a girl. If it's a boy, it likes things that move and fit together, things that later will show up in spatial abilities. What are they naturally attracted to? Human faces. And it turns out also, Simon Baron-Cohen shows that testosterone is highly related to these early preferences. So if you were exposed to more testosterone in utero, you'd be more, whether you're a boy or a girl, you'd be more attracted to the spatial things, less attracted to the faces. And indeed, Baron-Cohen shows that the extreme male brain, the brain that has been cooked in a little bit too much testosterone, is autistic. That, in other words, is sort of like Rain Man, really good at numbers and spatial relations, but cannot figure out people to save his life. That is a fascinating finding. And the more testosterone in the system, the more like that you are. There's another character in this story named Griffin Hansberry, who discovered, who's a woman who discovered, though, she was one of these women who felt like she was a man trapped in a woman's body. So she decided to have a sex change operation. And she wrote this beautiful paper, or he wrote this beautiful paper. He's now a psychotherapist / poet. And there's a wonderful paper about getting the testosterone injections on a daily basis and what happened to his thinking when that started happening. And one of the things that happened was the whole relationship to sexuality changed. You going from a woman's sort of view of sexuality to a male view of sexuality, and that's a pretty big difference. But aside from that, she said, you know, my whole life, no interest in science or math whatsoever. I started getting the testosterone injections, and all of a sudden I wanted to figure out how things worked. I started getting really interested in science. And that's a really interesting experiment. It doesn't prove that much because it's one person, but it's very suggestive to me. At the same time, it would be a mistake to think that testosterone in biology is the whole story here. I want to argue that we have misunderstood the nature of intelligence for a long time. There's been a lot of research that has been ignored that points to the fact that human intelligence is a lot more fragile than we tend to think. We tend to think of intelligence as this quality that you have inside your head. It's a lump of something, brain, material, and that something is something you take from situation to situation. If you're smart in one situation, you'll be smart in another situation, and you'll be what we call a smart person. However, that doesn't really fit with the data very much. The data fit better with the notion that I found in one of my favorite education writers who said, human intelligence is among the most fragile things in nature. It doesn't take much to distract it, suppress it, or even annihilate it. And the reason is that human intelligence is better thought of as a transaction between people. Because when you're expressing your intelligence, there's always some kind of relationship going on. A teacher is asking you a question on a test. Somebody is asking you a question. You're behaving typically either with an audience around or with the audience that we all carry around in our own heads. And that expression of intelligence is therefore transacted within a web of social relations that can themselves be highly fragile and situationally responsive. Let me give you a few examples. I think most people notice that there are what we would call interpersonal chemistry effects. The idea that you're kind of a different person with any other person that you meet. So, for example, I feel sometimes like more charming or more intelligent when I'm with certain people than I do with others. I feel, for example, my students all think I'm really smart, and I write books and I write articles and I win awards and I get on TV and stuff like that. And I feel like people want to hear what I want to say. And I feel interesting most of the time. But every time I'm with my mother-in-law, I feel like the most boring person who ever walked the earth. And that has more to say about our relationship than it does about the stuff in my head. And yet, the stuff in my head gets suppressed, distracted, and annihilated when I'm with my mother-in-law. And I know I'm not the only person who feels that way because I talk to a lot of guys about their mother-in-laws. There was this book by this guy, Joseph Heller, who wrote this book called Good as Gold. And it was about, imagine somebody who is, the president is thinking of putting him in his cabinet, and he's one of the highest paid lawyers on Wall Street, let's say. But on the back of the book, it sort of lists all these great accomplishments, and then it says, but his family thinks he's a schmuck. And I think that captures the social nature of intelligence. Now, more scientifically, there's this notion that is proven by lots and lots of research of all different kinds: anthropological research, sociological research, social psychological experiments, that people have a powerful human need to belong. None of us in this room escapes that. Aristotle was probably the first to say that, but not the first to observe it, that man is a social animal. Anybody who can get along with others is either a god or a beast. And the reason that's true is because of evolution. Because long ago, belonging, fitting in, knowing where you fit in the social order had a life or death quality to it, so that the only people that survived and passed on their genes were either those who were smart enough to figure out what other people were doing, what they were up to, how to manage their relationships, how to know whether somebody was a friend or a foe, or you were big enough to defeat all other enemies. So because of that, the legacy of that kind of situation over the millennia, we have very powerful systems, brain systems, that are there for the only reason to figure out whether we fit in situations. What other people, we care very much about what other people are doing. This is why we're so interested in reality shows. We're very interested in People magazine. You don't have to pay people to read these things because we have brain systems that have developed to care what other people are doing in their lives, even though that has no bearing on our life whatsoever, what Brad and Angelina are up to at this particular moment. We just care about it. We can't explain why. This is rooted in our need to belong and our need to fit in. One of the implications of having such a powerful need to belong and such a set of brain systems that is devoted to that is that when the need to belong is threatened in some way, it takes on such importance that other important cognitive functions or self-regulatory functions simply shut down. So, for example, in a very famous study by Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist, he finds that if he can threaten people's need to belong merely by giving them some information that suggests that one day they will be lonely, that other people will reject them, he finds that people in that condition of an experiment who take a standard IQ test will lose almost a standard deviation of intelligence. That's about 10 items on a standard IQ test, because you're sitting there thinking, oh my God, I don't belong. So when belongingness is threatened, intelligence goes out the window. Now, you would think that people in this experiment would be sort of, from the sound of it, foaming at the mouth, or, you could read it on their face that they've had this devastating experience, but you actually can't. One of the most fascinating things about this research is that it is the symptom of this threat to the need to belong is a shutting down, an actual numbness. People feel less. And so often, when you're a teacher in a classroom and students look bored and you talk to them afterward, why do you look so bored in class? I'm not bored, I was just afraid of making eye contact with anyone. Fear and boredom often are easily mistaken one for the other. Okay, Then there's this third thing that Claude Steele and I named stereotype threat or identity threat, and that is defined as the potentially disruptive psychological discomfort arising from the awareness of a negative group or personal reputation in a situation where the reputation is relevant and thus confirmable. If strong enough, stereotype threat can interfere with intellectual performance. And it appears to account, from lots and lots of studies that we've done, to account for a significant portion of the achievement gap. Let me give you some examples of stereotype threat. A Jewish person in the Bible Belt, this is not a random example. I'm a Jewish person and I used to live in the Bible Belt, and I would get questions like this from people. So, you're Jewish, would you tell me why Jews are so good with money? And I go, are we? This was with a realtor, and we were like at lunch after looking for a bunch of houses, and she goes, do you folks have something genetic that makes you good with money? And I remember thinking, after being a little bit offended by that, I gave this woman a 5-minute lecture on social psychology of stereotyping and prejudice, and she was great. She was like, oh, I see, so I've heard this stereotype and now I'm applying it to everyone I meet. I get it. Very good. The funny thing that happened, though, is that after talking her out of her stereotype, I faced a funny predicament because we were at lunch and it came time to pay for the lunch bill. And I didn't know whether, this was the first time I was buying a house, and I didn't know what the correct etiquette was. Am I supposed to offer to buy lunch, or is the realtor supposed to offer to buy lunch? Turns out the realtor really should do it, but I didn't know. And so I thought, well, I should offer to buy for lunch because if it's etiquette and I'm not doing it, that's really bad form. And then it hit me that if I offer to buy lunch and it's really her job to do it, she's going to think, boy, look at this rich Jew offering to buy my lunch. He must really be loaded. Boy, that stereotype I had was really right. So I said to myself, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to offer it. But then it hit me that there's this other stereotype about Jewish people, that we're stingy, right? And so I was sort of stuck because I could hear in my mind her telling her friends, I know how they get so rich. They don't buy anyone lunch. So I didn't know what to do. That's sort of one example of being threatened. I refer to that as a stereotype trap, because anything you do in that situation is going to confirm one or another stereotype about your group. African Americans are well aware in this country of the fact that they aren't supposed to do as well as whites on IQ tests, so that is a loaded situation that can interfere with IQ test taking. A woman called upon in a math class, and George W. Bush, and any form of public speaking, because we know that he is not supposed to be good at public speaking. The most surprising thing about him, though, is how good he used to be at public speaking. In fact, when he ran for governor in 1994, I saw this debate between him and Ann Richards where he just killed her in this debate. And she was supposed to be much smarter than him and much better on her feet. He wiped the floor with her and won the election. Nobody believes that story, so I encourage you to go online and look at tapes of this guy. He's actually quite smart. The question is, what happened? How did he go from being really polished? And this is one person's description of him. Bush was eloquent. He spoke quickly and easily. He rattled off complicated sentences and brought them to the right grammatical conclusions. He mishandled a word or two, maybe, million when he clearly meant billion, stole when he meant sold, but fewer than most people would in an hour's debate. More striking, he did not pause before forcing out big words, as he so often does now, or invent mangled new ones. Then something happened after 2000, and he started coming out with stuff like this. I know that people are working hard to put food on their family, and I collect these. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Bush Dyslexicon, and so I have all of these quotes, but my personal current favorite is, I couldn't imagine somebody like Osama bin Laden understanding the joy of Hanukkah. That one just gets me. What happened to this guy to turn him from an eloquent, smart guy to the person we know who says things like this? Well, some people think that he's suffering from brain damage, and yet neurological exams performed recently show that he is not suffering from brain damage. So if it's brain damage, it's of the sociogenic nature, that something's going on socially. What I can find that strengthens my case that it's stereotype threat is that before 2000, you couldn't find any evidence in the paper that this man was thought of as really unintelligent on a large scale. But then he gave an on-camera interview in which he was asked to name some of the leaders of other countries, and he was unable to do it. And from that point on, he developed this stereotype about him that he's not smart, and it's been downhill ever since. In reality, he's quite bright, and here's the proof, because we all believe in SAT scores. When I get people to estimate his SAT score, by and large, the average is 1030. His actual SAT score was 1330, much smarter than most of us would think. And as Bush himself said, people, they misunderestimated me. Now, I want to show you some early experiments, because so far I've just been talking anecdotally. If it's the case that people are impaired by a stereotype that alleges lower ability, people from Bush to people like me to people who take standardized tests under the implication that they're not smart, we should be able to change the situation for them in a way that should boost their intelligence by taking away that feeling of stereotype threat. In our first experiment done by Claude Steele and myself, we had African American and white college students take a very difficult verbal exam under a condition that either allowed stereotype threat to operate or one that should reduce stereotype threat. And in the standard stereotype threat condition, you just give them the test the way we normally get the test. This is a test of your ability. It will tell us how bright you are in the verbal domain. And in the no stereotype threat condition, or the reduced stereotype threat condition, we gave them the same exact test, and we told them that the meaning of this test, it's not an intelligence test. We're not interested in measuring your intelligence. And then we looked at how well they performed. When we told them that we were measuring their ability, we see a large black-white difference, with whites scoring much better than blacks. However, that effect shrinks dramatically by African Americans, a big boost to their performance when they think we're not measuring their performance and evaluating their ability. As for women, we found that the same thing happens. When men and women simply are given a math test that's supposed to measure their mathematics ability, we find that men outperform women by a large margin. But when we undo the stereotype threat in that situation by telling people that this test they're about to take has never shown a gender difference, we find that men score a little bit worse and women score a lot better. In the 15 years since we started this research, there have been over 300 replications, published replications of these basic effects, and they've been extended to other groups. Latinos taking verbal tests, they show the same pattern. Old people taking short-term memory tests. Students of low socioeconomic background taking verbal tests. Blacks and whites playing miniature golf. Not a huge problem in this country, the low miniature golf scores, but a beautiful study nonetheless. In it, people were asked to play miniature golf and to do their best. Half of them were told that the miniature golf task measured a certain kind of kinesthetic intelligence. By attaching the word intelligence to the task, what they did was to produce an effect, a score differential where white students performed particularly well and African American students performed particularly poorly. In a different set of conditions, playing the same golf task, the same population of participants, the task was framed as a measure of natural athletic ability. In that case, the white students underperformed relative to the black students, and the black students went up. People are very responsive to the framing of tasks in ways that are stereotype consistent. Women have long been suspected of being not as good at politics as men. And one way this has been reflected is that if you give men and women political knowledge tests, women do worse. I always figured that they were just less interested in politics, but there's no reason to think why that would be true. We did some studies showing that if you conduct a phone interview using a political knowledge test and you call up men and women, whether the woman is interviewed by a man or a woman makes a big difference. So women score better on the political knowledge test by a lot if they're being interviewed by a woman. Same questions, same amount of time, they do a lot better because the context is now one in which is no longer stereotype threatening. Men do just as well in either, whether being interviewed by a man or a woman. White males are often accused of lacking social sensitivity. I know because I am a white male and I do lack social sensitivity. And it's true that in studies where we test males on their social sensitivity, they do a lot better if the task is not framed as a measure of social sensitivity. I call that the Bill O'Reilly effect. White males taking math tests. Now, in the beginning of this, I said that I think stereotype threat is something that can happen to anyone. I really believe that, and one of the reasons I really believe it is because of this study that I did about 6 years ago, in which we wanted to show that even very, very bright people can succumb to stereotype threat, even people at the highest levels of achievement, even people who are not suspected of lacking ability in a domain. So we had Stanford white male engineering students who had a minimum SAT score of 700 on the math portion of the SAT take a very difficult math test. Half were told that we're giving you a very difficult math test and it's a measure of your mathematics ability. They were happy to take this test. The other half were given the same test and were told that everything that the first group was told, that it's a test of your mathematical ability. But we were doing this experiment because we wanted to see why Asians were so good at math. And what we found was that when we were just measuring their math ability, they did really well. When the same group was told that Asians, you were going to be compared to Asians, they suffered a decrement of almost an entire standard deviation in math intelligence performance. So if it can happen to these guys, it can really happen to anyone. And indeed, the size of this effect is as large as any race effect that we've ever seen. From over 200 published studies, we know that the impairment occurs both on tests and in terms of GPA, although the process is quite different. Basically, it affects GPA because students start trying less hard in areas where they're threatened. Impairment on test results from anxiety, reduced working memory capacity, impaired self-regulation, and it's not typically a function of just not trying hard. People are trying hard. They're trying hard to not disprove to disprove a stereotype. And often when you try too hard on a test that's very difficult, you will undermine your own performance. There's been some interesting work where students taking tests under stereotype threat have their brain functions scanned at the same time. And what's very interesting is that when women are taking mathematics tests, different parts of their brains are lighting up than when men are taking the same test. And social neuroscientists think that each part of the brain has a special function. And so I'm not sure how much I believe this, but it's quite interesting that they argue that when women are doing math problems under stereotype threat, the part of your brain that deals with social threats is lighting up. Whereas with men, it's just the math part, the reasoning part is lighting up. Women have to bring online a lot of other stuff in order to get through the math problems. It can affect elite or non-elite students, can arise as a function of simply mixing students. If I have a group of women taking a math test, and I bring one man into the group, the women's test scores will fall a little bit. If I bring another man into the group, the women's test scores will fall just a little bit more. And for each man you add, there will be a slight decrement. And it gets particularly bad when women are outnumbered in math, in the situation, which they almost always are in high-level math courses in this country. You have a big group of men, lots of them Asian, and a small huddle of women. And so there is an effect of that mixing, of that being outnumbered. How am I doing on time? We found that students who are chronically stereotype threatened will start to avoid practice. They'll start to avoid situations that involve challenge. When students who are stereotype vulnerable get into middle school and they can start making choices, this is where students, merely by being Black or Latino or a girl in the domain of math and science, will start making different choices based on how threatened they feel. So the typical move is to choose the easier line of questions, to take easier classes. And as any educational psychologist will tell you, that is a recipe for ending up way behind, because the less you challenge yourself, the less you practice, the less intellectual development you will enjoy. Just a quick point that there's a number of things that make some people more vulnerable than others. Some people kind of believe the stereotypes, and those people do worse on tests. Some people expect a lot of prejudice, some people less so. High expectations of prejudice lead to more negative outcomes. Some people believe the tests are really biased against their group. Those people tend to do worse on the tests. Some people care a lot more than others about doing well on tests. Those people do worse on tests. If you get people, for example, to tell you how much they care about doing well in math and they circle a 10, they will do worse on a test under stereotype threat than somebody who has circled 6 or 7. The more you care, the more vulnerable you can be to the implication that you're not good at something. People who highly identify with their racial or gender group also tend to be more vulnerable. I was telling you about testosterone. It turns out that the largest sex differences between males and females in math are on spatial ability. Tests where you are rotating three-dimensional objects in space are hugely responsive to testosterone, and they show the biggest gender gaps. In fact, they may account for the largest portion of the math gap, because the problems on which you do sort of spatial stuff are the problems that women tend to miss. And women tend to miss fewer of the other kinds of computational problems. This is what's called the Vandenberg mental rotation task, and it has shown in studies with hundreds of thousands of subjects a reliable sex effect across age spans. So what you do is you take the left-hand item and you match it to the two items that are rotated in space. And so if I were to give you this exam and also measure the amount of testosterone in your saliva, I would find a correlation. Those with more testosterone would do better at this test. And the fact, and if I gave you testosterone injections, I would increase your performance on this task by a lot. Now, to some people, that means that that's the end of the story, that this is fully mediated, that these spatial ability differences are completely mediated by male hormones. They are not. We recently published a study in which we wanted to see if people's mindsets might have similar effects on mental rotation. So if you were in this study, you would take a task that consisted of about 30 of those items that I just showed you. But before you did it, we would ask you about 3 questions designed to put an idea in your head. In one condition, we would have asked you, hey, tell us a couple of nice things about living in the Northeast. Those are the bars that you're seeing now. Men are the blue bar, women are the pink bar, and that's their performance on the Vandenberg mental rotation task. However, some people got a different set of questions, questions that made them think about their gender. We asked them, tell us a couple of things that you like about living in a co-ed dorm. Men are thinking about the fact that they're men, women are thinking about the fact that they're women. And that produces a huge split in their performance on this task. So men are thinking about their men, they do better on this male task. Women are thinking about the fact that they're women, they do worse on this male task. The beauty of this study, though, is not simply showing that you can do with ideas what other people do with testosterone. It's that you can wipe out this effect by getting people to think about a positive identity. So we asked people in the third condition to tell us a couple of nice things about being a student at a highly selective liberal arts college, something designed to put in their heads the fact that they were highly selected students. And in that condition, the gap almost fully disappears. This gap that is supposed to be all about the juice that men carry around in their bodies. When Lawrence Summers got into trouble, he was talking about the low numbers of women at the highest levels of the science pipeline. Why aren't there more engineers? Why aren't there more women physicists? So we went to the highest scoring classes of females in mathematics pipeline that we could find. And these are the highest level calculus students at the University of Texas. And again, I mentioned this before, you go into this class, it's third year calculus, all the students in this class are so good and so dedicated to mathematics because they want to be scientists. And we thought, well, gee, maybe we won't find any effective stereotype threat among these students because they're so darn good. You go into this class and it's mostly men, most of those are Asians, and then there's this little group of women huddled in this one part of the classroom, totally outnumbered. We had the professor give them an exam, and in one case, the exam was just given as part of the class. This will count towards your grade, and this is what we've been studying. Take the test, and the women did just as well as the men. Because after all, these are women who have been going through the difficult stereotype threat environments all the way up to this highest level. There's not a whole lot of these women, but they seem to be every bit as good as the men. But then we had another condition in which we got the professor to remove the stereotype threat inherent in that exam by saying what we've done in other studies. Please know that this test has never shown a gender difference before. And in that case, the women in pink bars outperform the men because they're actually smarter than the men at calculus. But the nature of the course has been holding them back so that they don't always get to demonstrate their superiority. What I think is going on here may be accounted for in that fMRI study. When you have to bring other stuff, get other parts of your brain working to fend off the implications of a social threat, like not doing well on a math test when you're a woman, and suddenly somebody takes away the need for you to light up that other part of your brain, which is worried about what happens if you don't do well, that energy goes somewhere, and it's now you're able to use it to solve the math problems. So in other words, you're getting to use all your intelligence now towards the task at hand. And under such circumstances, the smarter people who get to use all their resources are going to be able to demonstrate it. And that's what's happened in this experiment. So the women are really, really hot here, and yet the normal testing that's going on in the classroom is not always letting them demonstrate that. We've tried to figure out what you can do about this. One of the things that I'm excited about are the role of implicit theories of intelligence. Every one of us has an implicit theory of intelligence. I mentioned at the beginning that most of us probably think of intelligence as this thing inside the head, and that my feelings about that have changed over time. Another dimension on which people think about intelligence is how fixed it is. Can you get smarter, or are you pretty much born with the same amount of intelligence that you're going to die with? Some people think that you can get smarter, that your brain gets smarter over time. Some people think that your intelligence is largely fixed at birth. This kind of mindset has been shown to have big implications for how people approach performance tasks. If you think that intelligence is fixed, you will tend to be more anxious on taking tests. You'll think that the test can mark you for life, so you get into this mindset that's very much like stereotype threat. So we thought that if we could reverse that mindset, teach people that their minds are like muscles that get smarter, this could relax them when they're taking standardized tests, and it might reduce the black-white achievement gap that we've seen on these tests. So we asked the question, what if you were led to believe that an ability somebody was testing you at is something you could get a lot better at? We're not usually told that with the SAT. We're usually told that this is a pretty good dipstick into your brain, and you might be able to improve your score a little bit, but not really. We told people in this study one of three things. Either the test, the difficult GRE verbal test they were about to take was just like the SAT. That was our control condition. Or, and you see the black-white gap there is pretty considerable. Or we told them that it was a non-improvable ability. No one gets better at this stuff, folks. And we see that both groups go down. And in fact, one way to get rid of the gap is to make everybody perform so badly that you basically wipe out the gap by making everyone stupid. In the third group, though, is the good news group. That's where we told people, hey, this test you're about to take is something you can improve on. What we found was the lowest amount of anxiety among these students and the highest performance. And the black-white gap there is not even significant. So with studies like that under our belt, we sought to do a more ambitious field intervention where we actually went out and taught children or college students to view their own intelligence as something that expands with work. And there's lots of science to suggest this now. We used to think 20 years ago that your brain was largely fixed and that if you had an IQ of 100, you would pretty much be an average intelligence your whole life. Turns out that hard work, love of learning can boost your intelligence in some cases by 30 IQ points, though not everyone believes this. What we did in this study, I'll go over it rather briefly, is we essentially did an attitude change campaign with kids in middle school. We taught some of them that their minds are like muscles and that you get smarter with hard work. We taught others that, and it's interesting, I call this the Japanese condition, because one of the most interesting facts about the difference between us and Japan that should make you think a lot about gender differences is that the gender difference between, there is a small gender difference, sex difference in math performance in Japan. It's tiny compared to ours in the United States. But the most interesting thing is that girls in Japan score way above boys in America. Even the highest level boys, mathematical boys in America, are below the highest level girls in Japan. And there's lots of reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that in Japan, they think of intelligence as something that you learn. You're not born smart. You get smart by working hard. And so they work their kids very hard there, and they have this very different view of intelligence. So we basically taught our kids to think like Japanese kids, that smart is something you get by working hard. We also gave them, had a condition in which they had role models who taught them that early difficulty in a domain is natural, that if they were struggling in middle school, they wouldn't always struggle. It's just par for the course. Everybody struggles. What that tends to do is reduce your stress about achievement. We had a third condition that was a control condition where they simply got a drug abuse message that they learned really well as the other students learned these experimental messages. Then we looked at their statewide standardized test scores. We found that among the girls, we were able to eliminate the math test score gap that you see in the control condition. The students in this school are doing pretty well, but you can see that the girls are really trailing behind the boys in math. This is a gap that started like a year before that wasn't there, but now emerges, and you can make it go away with a simple intervention. And these other two conditions did that really nicely. Latinos in the same study did far better on their reading end-of-year test. So it's amazing what you can do with just a couple simple ideas that sort of get at the crux of what is upsetting people when they are being tested under and they're suspected of inferiority. We've done this with college students too, taught half of them that the pink bars, that these bars, that their brains are like muscles. This is after 4 months. They're both whites and blacks, but especially blacks are getting higher grades after that simple intervention. Finally, a question I always get is, well, given these results, why doesn't the Educational Testing Service change the way they do their tests? And how have they responded to this? Well, not well. They haven't liked this research. And they tried to hire me a long time ago. And I said, sure, if I can look at the data that we're collecting. And they said, sure. And then they sent me a contract that said, and by the way, you can't look at the data. That's pretty much been the way they've gone about treating stereotype threat, which is too bad because as the next study will show, which is conducted by the ETS, they could really level the playing field a lot more by changing the way they present some of their tests. On the AP Calculus test, before you start taking your tests, you tell them whether you're black or you tell them whether you're a female. Now, we found in studies that doing that, all other things being equal, in a non-threatening situation, will turn on stereotype threat and lower your performance. So they did a study in which they either had you take the test the normal way, or they had you take the test with that demographic stuff moved to the end. If you got the inquiry about your sex and race beforehand, this is what the data look like. Men are doing much better than women on the formula score, that's AP Calculus. Look what happens when you move that information to the end of the test. This is how people would be scoring if that information were actually moved to the end of the test. But as you can see from this data, the ETS has a real quandary here, right? Because not only do the women do better, the men do worse. So they have to decide what they're going to do about this. And I've seen how they've dealt with this. The testing companies have to stay faithful to the way they did things last year. And last year they had to be faithful to the way they did things the year before. It's all in the name of test, retest, reliability. And so we're kind of stuck here in a situation where they can't really do anything. Had it totally just brought women up without lowering men's scores, they might have gotten away with it. But so what they've done with this is to publish these results and to argue that these results don't mean anything. That's been their approach. So I'll leave it to you to decide whether they don't mean anything. But first I'll show you what these numbers translate to. Because a very bright colleague of mine reanalyzed their data and used their numbers to come up with the following prediction. Women benefited substantially on the calculus test when demographics were asked after testing rather than before. This simple, small, and inexpensive change could increase U.S. women receiving AP Calculus AB credit by more than 4,700 women every year. and they won't do it. And instead of admitting that it's because it gets them into big trouble, they're pretending that these data that they collected are wrong. That's the ETS. But to me, what this means is that all this stuff that we've done in our laboratories really makes a difference in the real world, even under normal testing conditions. To summarize, over 200 published studies support the notion that human intellectual performance is fragile. It can be significantly boosted or undermined depending on the social cues in an environment, what faculty do and say, and how they organize their classrooms, how tests are given, can make a big difference in whether environments nurture or undermine intelligence. I'll leave you with my favorite current quote from Richard Mulcaster, who was the headmaster of the school that he started, which in London, which educated some of the best people, people like Edmund Spencer in the late 1500s. And he said, by nature implanted, for nurture to enlarge. And by that, he means that, yeah, nature gives us little differences between groups. Maybe men and women differ a little bit. But culture makes a big deal about those differences, tells a story about it, and those stories enlarge the differences. And so the stories that we tell our students that can make a huge difference in whether we enlarge the differences or make them go away. Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions?
I think we have, there should be mics out there somewhere.
Whoops.
Call on who you'd like.
Okay. Anybody? Yes.
And there are no gender differences.
Thank you very much. That
Yeah.
was a wonderful lecture.
Thank
So I
you.
wanted to ask you about the ETS. I'm interested in the extent to which one can wipe out these stereotype effects if you tell students taking the exam beforehand about the effect.
Yeah.
So in the example of the ETS, of course, they're shutting down the data, and you've outlined some reasons why that might be. But, I mean, surely one of the things is to let it be known as widely as possible, that data, and thereby, if women, for example, have to check off their gender on the way in, they should be told ahead of time what to watch for. And I'm wondering about the empirical basis for this wiping out by making it public and enunciating the effect. How does that actually affect
So,
the
in other words,
It's a
are you-
second order
yeah.
sort of an issue.
Mm-hmm.
But my hypothesis would be, my guess would be, my understanding from looking at what I've looked at is this actually has an impact, public dialogue about the
Yeah.
fact of the studies. So
Yeah,
I wonder if you
there've
could
been-
comment on that.
It's a great question, and there have been a number of studies that show that the way we talk about these things matters. And so there was an article in Science magazine showing that people who read an article that suggested that the differences were caused by biology, women who read that did worse on a later test. But the more encouraging stuff is that if people read and learn about stereotype threat itself and how it works, they are less vulnerable to its effects. So we did a study in which we said, you're going to be in a study, and it's a memory study, and you need to read an article, and then you're going to come in and have your memory tested at some later point. And so we had various groups, but one was a group that read a Newsweek article about stereotype threat. And we added to it information that said, so if you ever find yourself in a situation like this, researchers have found that the best thing to do is take a deep breath and just get right back to work. If thoughts about gender and stereotypes or tension of any kind enter your head, take a deep breath and move on. Giving them that simple strategy made a big difference. So people who read that article did a lot better on the test. In fact, there was no gender, there was no race effect anymore than people who got a different article sent them in the mail. I think it was on the migratory patterns of the monarch butterfly. So it really seems to be the case that understanding how your brain works can often help you function better. The science article made me uncomfortable because it seemed to be sort of saying we shouldn't talk about nature versus nurture. And I think that's a bad implication. I think the whole notion that we shouldn't talk about these things is highly problematic. And I didn't like watching that whole Lawrence Summers thing unfold where Nancy Hopkins, who's a friend of mine, sort of left the room. She couldn't listen to it. And, you know, we need to entertain these theories in order to understand them. And I think that out of the deepest kind of understanding, you realize that these effects that we think are rooted in biology are highly amenable to psychology. Other questions? Yes.
Can you talk a bit more about under what conditions that, I think it's called stereotype reactance, where people are actually boosted, like the men are boosted when their gender is, their performance boosted.
Yeah,
Under what conditions?
It seems to be the case that all other things being equal, when you perceive that the playing field is tilted towards your team, your race, your gender, you get a little lift out of it. Now, it's not a huge effect, but you see it when you average across studies. So if you do a meta-analysis, you find a consistent lift effect, which is like a tiny little effect, but I think in every study that I presented, there's a little bit of a lift effect. And it goes away when you tell people that the playing field is not tilted. So if you say, by the way, this test has never shown a gender difference before, the men's performance comes down in that condition a little bit. And in every case where there is that kind of dominant group, when you tell them that they're not so dominant, that there's reasons that they won't be dominant, there's a little bit of a lift or a decline. So people get a lift out of the fact that this is kind of an unfair playing field. That's the stereotype lift. Yeah.
Well, being a biologist, the other perspective makes sense because you said that there was other activity going on that was distracting from the intelligence. But how do you actually explain what you've just said in that kind of perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Psychologists group these two kinds of effects into, they talk about separate processes. There's what I would refer to as a threat effect, where you're kind of aware that you're under evaluation, and if you don't do well, it's going to make you or your group look bad. But then there's this whole other category of effects that psychologists call idiomotor effects, and it was well described in that book by Malcolm Gladwell called Blink. I don't know if you read that book, but there's a whole host of studies where anybody who is primed with a particular stereotype or idea will enact that stereotype. So, for example, the classic idiomotor effect is if I do a crossword puzzle and a lot of the words suggest to me old age, like Florida, retirement, Walker, that after I complete that puzzle, I will actually walk away more slowly from the experiment than a person who got a different kind of crossword puzzle that didn't have that kind of word in it. And people do that totally without awareness. And it's just sort of like whatever is on the tip of your consciousness, you enact in some way. And it's wholly unmediated by any kind of conscious psychological process. I don't fully understand it. It feels like magic to me. But there's been enough studies to where that show that kind of effect that I have to accept that they happen. So within the domain of performance, you get this interesting trade-off. So you can see within the same study, if I ask an Asian girl to color in a picture And in the picture is a picture of somebody eating with chopsticks. She colors that picture, then I have her do a math test. She will do better on that math test, slightly, than somebody who colored in the same picture with a fork rather than the chopsticks. What that does, it brings to mind in a subtle way all the stereotypes associated with being Asian, and it leads to higher math performance. Now, I should say, the effects are not huge. We're not talking about somebody going from, Homer Simpson level to Einstein. We're talking about a very small, maybe one-item effect, but it's a statistically significant effect. The other interesting thing that happens is if you say to that same little girl, I hear that you Asians are really smart at math. Here's a test, prove it to me. She will do worse than if she wasn't, if the whole Asian notion wasn't. So if something reaches some level of consciousness where you're actually trying to either prove a positive stereotype or disprove a negative stereotype, then it causes underperformance. If something just suggests to you subtly a positive stereotype about your group, it'll lift your performance. So two different processes, but they can sometimes get confused with one another because they produce differences in performance. Yeah.
I appreciate what you have to say, and I think in the field of education it's important to think about how this, in fact, could do a great deal for those who are future educators. So I applaud the
Thank you.
importance of the work and its implications there.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on the role of anxiety and the issue of anxiety and its impact on performance, where we have lots of evidence across domains, not only in the language-based intelligence area, that anxiety plays a great role in terms of performance.
Well, I've always talked about stereotype threat effects as anxiety effects. And one of the clearest ways that you see it is that with certain kind of tasks, stereotype threat actually improves performance, because when we get energized, when we get aroused, simple tasks become facilitated, but highly complicated ones get undermined. And so there's a wonderful study by Laurie O'Brien where she gives women easy math problems, and they prime the stereotype in the environment about women in math, and on the easy problems, the women do better than the men, because they're like really, they're channeling in that anxiety into action, speed. But on another set that were very difficult, they did worse than the men. So anxiety is very clearly involved. Anxiety never comes all by itself. There's usually other brain level effects that happen too. And what psychologists are looking into are things like, in addition to the HPA axis being activated, they're looking at what's called executive function, sort of your brain's ability to manipulate information. And those two things work at cross purposes often. Yeah.
A practical question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any daughters?
I do.
Would
Exactly
you send them,
one.
Exactly one.
Mm-hmm.
Would you send her to a single-sex school?
Yes, I would, but let me say that doesn't mean that I fully believe that single-sex schools are better. I'm asked this all the time because we've done these studies that show like girls in a group do better than if you add boys to it. Did you see the New York Times piece, the New York Times magazine about single-sex schools?
Yes.
One of the reasons that people are still divided on whether they work or not because there is not a single randomized controlled study. All these studies, you can do 1 million studies, but if the parents have the choice of whether to send their kids to a single-sex school or not, you can never interpret the results correctly, right? Because it might be about the parents and how much they care about you. So I make that determination whether I do that with my daughter because I would talk to my daughter and ask her under which conditions she feels she functions better. And I already know that she would function better without the boys around. She doesn't like the boys very much.
How old is she?
I'm very happy about that.
Is there a last question? Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.